2024 is being called the biggest election year in history, and with good reason. 7 of the world's 10 most populous countries, including the United States, will hold national elections this year, and there is a lot to unpack. I'm Billy Hollowell, and I'm joined today by Ian Giotti from the Christian Post. He is the host of the upcoming show, Politics in the Pews. This is a show that is going to dive deep into the political spectrum through conversations with a variety of evangelical voices from across the political spectrum. Ian is going to be diving into a variety of issues: the history and influence of the evangelical movement in American politics, where churches and Christian leaders stand, and so much more. You are not going to want to miss Politics in the Pews, and today is a very special preview of what's to come. Here is Ian Giotti. Ian, I am really excited to be here with you today talking about your new show, giving a preview. It's Politics in the Pews. This is going to be a really important podcast for this season, this election season, and really beyond. Can you tell us a little bit about what you want to accomplish with Politics in the Pews?
I think what the point of all this is, we want to really focus our audience and Christians at large in America to start thinking about the significance of this election. And I know in a way there's a lot of election fatigue already, especially this point in the cycle. We're almost there. We're about, as of this conversation, we're 4 months or 5 months away. But I think that actually makes it more important to reinitiate the conversation, get people talking about why this matters, what's at stake. And really, ultimately, I think, to get Christians engaged and involved. I know there was, as I spoke to all these different guests for this podcast, across the political religious spectrum, right? What I found was that there was this underlying concern about engagement, making sure people know that they do have to come out and vote. They do have to make their voices heard, because we can't, at this point, take anything for granted. This is a very unusual election cycle, as everyone well knows, and it likely may get even more unusual as we go forward. So I just think it's important to press that home with not just the church, but really voters across the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much at stake, and it's so complicated. And that's one thing that I love about Politics in the Pews is you're taking a documentary style look at some of these issues. What are some of the specific topics that you're going to be covering?
Well, we want to kind of really hinge the entire event around 3 big ideas, or 3 big discussions. The first one is really kind of taking a look at where we've been as a country and as the church, the history of the religious right movement, for example, the moral majority, how evangelicals have influenced politics over the last half century, and then kind of taking the pulse of the church with just a few weeks to go at that point when our event takes place before the 2024 election, why this election matters, what's at stake. People understand that, they're so used to hearing this could be the most important election of your lifetime. Well, I think there's a sense now that as election integrity becomes in itself a huge conversation, people are aware of that. Wow, if we ignore this right, really this privilege and this right to go cast our vote, that could be something that we lose at some point. And so I think that really that first panel is going to be taking a look at where we are, where we've been as a movement, right, as the evangelical church, and then where we're going. The second panel is going to look at this notion, what our senior managing editor calls the red herring of Christian nationalism, and this discussion around what it is, what it isn't, how it's being used to bludgeon the church and silence the church, versus the concerns within the church about what it may be and how it may look, if practically applied. And then hand in hand with that, of course, is a conversation around, former President Donald Trump, who is the presumed GOP nominee at this point, and how that all fits together, what a second Trump administration would mean for the church, what it would mean for all sorts of topics, including Christian nationalism. And so that's gonna be a really dynamic and interesting conversation. And then the last panel is going to focus on primarily religious liberty, religious freedom, where we are in this country. This is a one of those topics that while politics per se tends to divide Christians, I think across the spectrum, wherever you are, the church can really come together over this idea of religious liberty, and the headwinds that we might be facing here in America and across the world, really, as the church. And so I think that's a great way to kind of wrap the event up and the podcast series up, and look at what it is that we're facing as a church.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues. You're hitting on so many of them, at the event, in the show, which I think is exciting. And obviously, one of the big questions people are going to have when you have a show like this, and you're diving in documentary style, you're hitting all these different issues. Who are some of the voices, maybe, that you could sort of tease, who are going to be involved in this show, in these episodes?
Yeah, well, like we're still confirming, we're still confirming our finalized guest list, but I can share with you that we do have commitments from people like Ambassador Sam Brownback, who's been a huge voice on religious liberty. Kelly Shackelford with First Liberty Institute is going to be joining us, as well as a number of others that I'm really proud to announce, and we kind of want to keep under wraps just as we, will officially announce them. But these people are authoritative in these various conversations, and they're really going to bring some insight, practical insight, as to how we can apply these conversations to not just our vote, but really, our walk as Christians with the Lord, like how this looks going forward, not just into the election, but beyond the election. Day one after the election, how are we to conduct ourselves? How are we to engage with the culture? So it's going to be a really dynamic, I think, conversation.
When it comes to the podcast itself, which topic, was the one for you internally? They're all really interesting topics, but that you were most interested in personally diving into?
I think this conversation about Christian nationalism is so fascinating, because it really is a. There really are conflicting opinions by good people on both sides, if I can put it that way. You have a church that's divided over this notion of what is Christian nationalism. Should we? Shouldn't we? What does Scripture say about this idea? And there are really passionate, knowledgeable, spirit-filled people who have their views. And it's one of those things where I think we can kind of learn from one another, and in a way almost kind of stabilize and steady one another in our exploration of these topics. I learned a lot from talking to the different guests. Dr. James Spencer with the D.L. Moody Institute is one great example where we had he gave this really measured, um, really exposition, really, on what Christian nationalism is, what it isn't, what the church, how the church should be responding. And we need to have those conversations, because if we're going to move past the political sectarianism that's really taking up so much of our time, I think this is an important discussion for the church to not just to have, but to hear and then take back to our fellowships and apply.
Yeah, at the end, and you sort of spoke to it there, but at the end of the day, when the event is done, when the podcast has aired, what are you hoping for the biggest impact in the hearts and minds of the people who have attended and also listened to the show?
Well, first and foremost, I really want this to catalyze them to go. Okay, I know I'm sick of hearing the headlines and the political back and forth, but this has really made me serious about getting to the ballot box on election day, making sure that I do my part as an American citizen in voting. I think that's super important, and that I think that's the primary reason we're there, is just to make sure Christians understand. Please go out and vote, regardless of what you may think about election integrity, regardless of what you may think about all that's going on. Go and carry out our civic duty. I think beyond that is to really awaken people to the time that we're living in, because there is going to be a day after this election and a day after that. And the country is undergoing a lot of changes right now. And I think we all feel it. We all sense it. And it will continue to do so regardless of the outcome of the election on any ballot, up and down the ballot. But I think we as the body of Christ need to start thinking practically instead of just about Sunday morning and how we can come together that way. I think we need to start understanding what it looks like to apply what we learn through the word and in fellowship and take it into the world and into the culture. And time to get serious about the future of this country, because there's a lot of things at stake. It really isn't just a talking point. I think we can sense that, we feel it, and I think it's time to get to work.
Yeah, final question for you, and it's kind of a big one, but I think it's important in light of the fact that you're doing this show, Politics in the Pews, and so much hinges on what happens in November. It's an important election. A lot of people, a sizable number of people in the church, Christians, have said, well, we don't really need to be involved in politics. Our kingdom, Jesus's kingdom is not of this world. And there's been a retreat, and understandably among some, because I think a lot of it is just, it's exhaustion, right? You get exhausted from fighting about it and talking about it. And there is a danger in obsessing over. But what do you think has driven some of that? And what would your message be to some of the apathy that we are seeing today in the church?
Well, one of the most interesting things I learned is talking to various historians for the podcast is that evangelicals kind of as a movement, as a political movement, they weren't really mobilized in this country until about the mid 70s or so. And the discussion for that is long winded, and for definitely I would refer people to the podcast because it's a fascinating conversation. But I say that to say that it hasn't always been this way. It hasn't always been evangelicals out there marching, and politicking. It took a while to get them kind of involved. And now that we're out there and now that we're part of the conversation, I think when I see people say, well, it doesn't really matter, God's in charge. And of course that's true, but that's casting aside the truth that is also applicable in this situation, which is that God is in charge with the founding of this country and the freedoms that we were given, not by men, but by God himself. And that are all of our founding documents are founded on that premise. And so if you do believe that, if you believe these are God-given rights, whatever they may be, I think Christians who say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with that, I think they're neglecting a biblical calling on their life. And, I think that's something that they should really pray about and really consider before simply just walking away from the conversation altogether. I think as we see more involvement and we want Christ to be exalted, it doesn't just start with our vote. It starts with the conversations that we're involved in. And the political conversation is getting further and further away from us because more Christians are saying, you know what, it's not worth it. And I couldn't disagree more.
Well, I think that's an important point, and this show is going to help sort of unpack some of the things that maybe lead to that apathy and really help people break through and understand. Ian, the show is Politics in the Pews. It will be premiering this summer, and it'll be right here where you're listening to this episode, the pre-show. We appreciate you joining us today. Ian, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Billy. Appreciate it.
Politics in the Pews premieres July 12th, wherever podcasts are heard. Be sure to head on over to Apple and other podcast platforms to subscribe to the show today. Again, July 12th is the premiere, and we'll see you back here then.